Hi everyone and welcome to this session. We are talking about crawling, indexing and log file analyzers in the next couple of minutes. My name is Andor, I'm an SEO consultant based in Berlin, Germany. I'm doing SEO since roughly 2009, 2010. I've worked in-house, I've worked in the agency, and in the last couple of years I'm also active as a brand ambassador for Majestic OnCrawl in Germany, as well as a search awards judge for several awards around the globe. 1.7 million liters of water needs a Google data center every day. That's over 600 million liters of water a year, and Google has approximately 23 data centers around the world. When I mention numbers like this in a marketing meeting, in a C-suite meeting, at least in the last couple of 1 or 2 years, I experienced that the people are paying more attention to what I'm saying because they totally understand that Google's resources are not God-given and that it may make sense from their perspective to really pay attention on the way how they are using Google's resources to ensure that their websites are being processed efficient as possible. Because if you think that a Google data center is, costing several millions of dollars, then it definitely makes sense to think about that Google's resources are not endless and that the way how we use their resources to, for example, process our websites needs to be as efficient as possible. With no surprise actually, therefore, it was already in 2022 when Geli Elias from Google started about talking the fact that Google needs to be more effective and efficient when it comes down to crawling and also being more environmental friendly. And he actually already touched a specific field where he thought that Google needs to be better, and that is the area of refresh crawls. Because in his opinion, he said that it doesn't make any sense from a Google point of view if they are hitting the same URLs again and again and again, especially when there has been no change at all. So for Google, it is really about how they allocate their resources so that they can process a lot of updated URLs without hitting the same URLs where there was no change at all. And actually, a couple of weeks, he added another interesting comment when he was asked if Google has already slowed down its crawling. And he actually declined that, but he added information that he said, well, we already got better in scheduling. So it is really the fact that Google is proactively working on the fact how they use their resources in a more efficient way. And this is something that should be in our mind, especially if you're dealing with bigger websites. And then there was actually another interesting quote from him regarding indexing, where he made the connection between the storage space Google has and the amount of URLs they can index. And he said, if Google has more space, then it may end up in a situation where more low quality content is able to be indexed. But that actually means the other way around, that if you are, for example, in a market with high competition and with a lot of quality content, that it may be more difficult to get indexed actually based on the fact that Google's storage is not endless. So keep that in mind. When we talk about crawling, we need to be aware of the 3 reasons why we talk about that. So the first reason is, of course, we want to ensure that newly published content gets processed, indexed as soon as possible. But we also want to ensure that updated content gets actually processed and reevaluated as fast as possible. And that is the entire area of refresh crawls. And of course, we want to do that in the most efficient way. And this is why we always also talk about site speed, because crawling budget is nothing else than computer timing. And the faster Google can process a website in the given time, the more information they can collect. And this is why we also talk about resources, CSS, JavaScripts, images, video files, and all that kind of stuff, because everything goes into that. And there may be some other interesting information we need to be aware of. The first one is that the crawl budget is allocated by the host. And that actually is especially important, for example, if you run a CDN or if you run a community or something like that. It makes a difference if it is on a subdomain or if it is on your main domain. Or we need to be aware of the fact that actually all bots are counting into the crawl budget, not just the regular web bot. So AdBot and all the others Google have all count together. And of course, we should be aware of the fact that every of these files can actually processed and indexed by Google. So it is not about what is actually in your infrastructure, it is about what is on your server. And this is why you need to have a look at files like this to really make sure if there's nothing behind your web structure. When we see pages like that, domains like that, it totally makes sense that Google is actually asking for more efficient websites, because if you are providing more than 30 times more URLs on the site that actually are being indexed, and Google needs to process that all, it definitely is a waste of their resources, and therefore it makes sense to really have an eye on these topics. And again, one note that when we talk about crawling, we are not talking about indexing. These are two different fields, and things like noindex tag or canonical tags are lovely ways to managing your indexing, but it is not about crawling. All pages that have a noindex tag or have a canonical tag needs to be processed by Google so that they actually can find and evaluate the information, and therefore they need crawling. So this kind of information does not prevent crawling at all. And then there was another interesting quote actually regarding JavaScript crawling and JavaScript handling from Google, but it is, in general speaking, quite interesting. There was a comment from Martin Splitt already in 2022 when he talked about the fact that when Google is, analyzing the raw HTML, it can actually already decide if the HTML is good or bad. And if the HTML is bad, this may lead to a field or to a situation where they take away their resources and that the entire processing of that URL is being delayed. So his actually idea was, if for example JavaScript website is handled slowly, it does not mean that this is just because of the JavaScript. So maybe the HTML is already bad, and if that is valid for, of course, a JavaScript website, then this is valid for more or less every website. So keep an eye on your HTML and if it is, in the most efficient way being presented. Because when we think about this kind of information from the Search Console, it actually makes sense that there must be something like a quality mechanism, right? So if Google can already decide after the fetching the HTML if the HTML is good or bad, and they have decided that they don't want to process that URL even further, then it makes sense that we see all these different statuses like currently crawled but not indexed and all these kind of stuff in the Search Console. So there is something like a multi-step approach, like a quality mechanism in their process. So, and if you see problems on your website like this, you may have to step back and have a bigger look of the overall quality of a website. And when we talk about crawling, we of course need to touch the fields of status codes just for a second, because generally speaking, when we talk about crawling, the fact or the one situation we definitely want to prevent are the server errors, because server errors are definitely one way how Google is taking away its resources, because if the server is not consistent and it can't really answer the request, then Google will not waste any time. You can probably see within minutes that Google is slowing down its crawling if you provide 400 status codes. And this is why you should always have something like a monitoring for your server so that you really can make sure that it is processed quite efficiently. And when we talk about the 500 status code, we also need to be aware of the fact that there's at least one file that is not allowed to provide a 500 status code, and that is actually the robots.txt. Because if the robots.txt is providing a 500 status code over time, that actually means that, or it actually can end up in a situation where Google is de-indexing the entire domain. So please make sure that this does not happen. When we talk about the 400 status codes, we all know, of course, that these status codes do actually not harm your crawl budget. Google is not taking them into calculation. However, there's one exception, of course, and that is a 429, because that one actually means too many requests. It sounds quite similar to a 500 status code, but it belongs to that family. However, if you see something like that in your crawling statistics, in your analyzers, then you definitely should have an eye on that, because that is actually hiding, and not hiding, but this is actually making your crawl budget worse. Then we need to talk about the Google IP addresses maybe for a second, because that was really a quite interesting change. Google has provided all its IPs from where it's crawling the web. And that was actually quite lovely, especially for bigger domains who have worked with technique like dynamic serving and reverse DNS lookup. So to improve their crawling, they use these techniques to maybe, don't show specific faceted navigations or things like that. So for Google, so that they don't need to crawl that. And that was actually always based on a reverse DNS lookup. Nowadays, as we know the Google IPs, it is much easier to provide or to use these techniques to really make sure that crawling gets more efficient. However, there's one other thing that was or is more easier now, and that is actually blocking all the fake bots. So presumably you have been running into blockers like these in the last couple of 1, 2, 3 years more often, because nowadays websites, especially bigger websites, especially websites that don't want to be maybe spied, and know that you are a fake Google bot because you maybe have changed your user agent, but you can't fake the IP, and therefore they know you are not the real Google bot, and therefore you get blocked. So this is a good sign that these websites do something in behind and actually know that you are just a fake bot and they want to block you. And then, of course, there was another interesting case regarding that, in field of information. That was actually that Reddit, of course, did not block Google. That was actually quite interesting situation where a lot of people are, freaked out because they have looked at the robots.txt from Reddit, and there was just a /disallow, and they thought that they would block actually all crawlers in general. And then, of course, if you picked up that piece of information, that robots.txt in the rich result test, then you saw another robots.txt, and that is what I just mentioned with dynamic serving. You're providing Google a different piece of information than maybe all other users, and that is actually what every competitor can do with you. So just have in mind that if you look at something from the outside, there is at least the potential that your web or your competitor is showing you something different than they are showing Google, and you probably will not see what they are showing Google. However, of course, Microsoft or let's say the Bing search was blocked by Reddit, but I guess this is for another political reason. Before we look into some data, I just want to add 1 or 2 additional notes which are maybe interesting to know. The first one is I want to make sure that we are all on the same page when we talk about log files and log file analyzers. So what is a log file actually? It is just a file where a certain information about the requests made are being stored. So, and the most important information are actually the host, the IP address, and then of course everything that is related with the user agent and how the request was answered. So the host is especially important, as well as the IP address, but the host especially because if you mix up data from different subdomains, and we have already learned that crawl budget is allocated by the host. You definitely want to make sure that you have the most valid data. And if you mix up log files from different hosts, from different subdomains, for example, that ends up in a situation where you screw up actually your entire results because they are more or less blended, and we don't want that. So have an eye on the fact that this information needs to be presented. The second one is, please have in mind that if you work with a load balancer, then you need to analyze the log files of the load balancer, because the load balancer is the last point of contact for the Google request and actually not your general server. And this is important because in some points the load balancer can actually rewrite certain information, like for example the status code. And I had that in my career at least twice, that the status code from the load balancer has been different than the ones from the original server. So if you get the log files from the load balancer and you crawl, or if you get the log files from the server and you crawl and you see differences, then you may have two different pieces of information, so from different areas. So have an eye on that. And in case you have no log files, then please at least use the Search Console inspection API, because with that you get the information for every URL, when it was crawled the last time, how many days has been passed since the last crawl. And with that information over time, you can actually at least make some assumptions about if your website is processed quite efficient or not. But let's start with looking into some data and to see what we really can get out of log file analyzers and all that data which is available for us. So let's imagine we do a web crawl, just a regular web crawl like I did, roughly 28,000 URLs, nothing too big. And then we look at the information in the Search Console, and we see there are roughly 300,000 indexed pages, and some millions on the side which are not indexed at all. In that particular moment, you instantly know that there must be something in between. That is such a gap that there must be a lot of orphan pages. There must be something which is Google presented, or which is seen by Google, but which is actually not inside your web crawl. And this is something really important. You need to understand that your web crawl is oftentimes just a simulation. The next thing you can actually do is you can add, for example, your Search Console data, your performance data, to see if there are some additional information here. And in that particular case, you can see that we still have our 28,000 pages in the structure, but we also had over 68,000 ranking pages in that report now. And by doing the math, there was just 10,000 of these 28,000 URLs that really got rankings. That means that over 58,000 URLs are actually orphan with rankings as well. So and therefore you see that there must be some problems maybe with the internal linkings. Why are there so many orphan pages? What is the reason behind that? If you see numbers like that, you definitely know that you have an issue in your infrastructure, which you then can actually have a look at. And the crazy thing is that we added then log files on top of that. And here it really, was stunning that we discovered over 700,000 orphan pages in that structure. And also we got the information that actually just 48% of these pages in that structure got crawled by Google. So really a lot of pages they had on their server and they had on their structure are not even crawled by Google at all. So, and now you can start actually to drill in and to really, try to analyze these infrastructure and try to improve it so that all important information and all important URLs are actually really being processed by Google. And the next thing I like to do in general is I like to build segments, because with segments you can add so many layers and you can look at the data from so many different views there are actually no limitations. So you can build segments on the directory level, which is, the default from OnCrawl, for example, but you also can do that by certain URL types. You can do that with your CP pages, with your PDP pages, with your regional pages, you can even do that with authors. You can organize a chart like that by authors. So there's really no limitation how you actually can segment your data, but it really improves the way how you can understand them. For example, we can have a look at the orphan pages and combine that with the number of sessions, because what I was interested in is how many orphan pages do we have that passes a certain amount of sessions. I don't want to deal with the URLs that are orphan and maybe have, between just 1 or 10 sessions, but I wanted to have a look at the ones that really drives traffic and to understand why they are not in the infrastructure. So you can combine the data like that. Or you can combine the URLs and the number of sessions. And then you can, for example, see how many URLs do you have that got a lot of traffic, got a lot of sessions, but are actually not crawled by Google, and compare that with URLs that got less traffic but got crawled by Google. And you can, make changes to reallocate the resources so that these pages that actually drive more traffic gets also, again, more crawled by Google. Or we can combine that in a way where we can see finally what URLs or how many URLs have rankings and got crawled by Google, how many URLs just got crawled by Google, and how many URLs do not even got crawled by Google. And then again, we can see that on a directory level or any other segment you have built. And then we can try to understand, okay, where are areas of inefficiency, where we can maybe dig into and try to implement changes so that more important information or more important URLs get processed better in the future. We, of course, need to have a look at the status codes, as already mentioned earlier, because here the devil lies in the details. If you see, a chart like that, it looks very green at the very first place, which is lovely. However, if you look at the numbers of the status code, you see something like the 204 status code, which is actually more than 70% the answer to a Google request. And that is actually a problem, because that one means that this page is actually completely empty. It is there, but it has actually no content. So it is a perfect soft 404 you can even imagine. And then there's another status code you want to have a look at, and that is the 304, because that one means actually not modified. But just imagine that this status code by default will be added to a URL which was maybe not changed in the last couple of weeks or so automatically, but it was a 204 status code before, or something that is like a soft 404, like Elias describes here. That could actually make the entire thing even worse, because you think, well, this is a 304 not modified, I don't have to look at that, but actually the information behind that is bad for your infrastructure. So really have that in mind, and maybe provide an analyzers for your 304 status code URLs, so that you really can make sure that there's nothing behind that can harm your crawling. And then, of course, we can look at things like the number of unique crawl pages, which is lovely if you know, for example, your baseline, the baseline of your domain. If you know you have roughly, let's say, 500,000 URLs on your structure, then this number shouldn't vary too much in one way or the other. If it does, you instantly know that there is something on the server that shouldn't be there, or maybe Google has a problem because they're just crawling less URLs than you would expect them, and therefore this is a lovely KPI for monitoring the crawling activities. Or of course we can look at the number of newly crawled pages. Let's imagine you are a dynamic infrastructure which is publishing 5,000 URLs every day. Can Google really crawl that in a specific time frame, or do they have problems to handle all these newly published URLs? This is also a lovely way how you can really have an eye on your publishing rate and if it really gets processed by Google. Or of course, we can look at things like the frequency per day, because let's assume that you make a change, you make an implementation, and you want to monitor if the crawling behavior is maybe changing, maybe allocating some resources from one directory to another. Can you really see that in your log files? Can you really see that how Google is, acting on the server? This is a way how you can, monitor these measures. And then of course, we can also have a look at things like, are your paginations crawled or not? We all know these sentence, long-term no index leads to no follow, but the question is that really the case on your server? And as you can see, there are quite a lot of paginations that got crawled by Google quite lovely. However, of course, if you can do that with paginations, we can do that with all kind of informations. And yes, there are paginations that gets crawled less. However, we can do that with no index URLs. We can do that with parameterized URLs. We can do that with every URL type and see if Google is really processing this type or not. We can have a look at the word count and to look if that actually affects the way how Google is crawling your website. We all know that word count is not really a ranking signal. However, you may see that pages with less content, so thinner pages, are being crawled less by Google. And if so, is there something you can do? Is there something you need to do? Why are they so thin in the first place? Can you pitch a content budget? Things like that you can consider now if you know that the thinner pages of your domain are being crawled less. Or we can look at the weight of a URL to see if this infects the crawling, what is with your lovely galleries, with the articles with videos included? Are they being crawled less because they are maybe more heavier than others? Or is there no difference at all? You can have a look at that by analyzing the log files. You can also look at the structure of the website and if that affects actually the crawling. So are URLs deeper in the hierarchy, less linked internally? Are they being crawled less? Or is there anything you can find out here? And maybe then you can analyze what kind of URLs are in that level, and then you can maybe make measures to reallocate internal linking, adjust internal linking to improve the crawling of these URLs in case they are worth it. We can of course also identify if the age of URLs may affect the crawling. Some domains are organized even by dates, or at least a lot of publishers of course provide a lot of content over time. And if you can see that over time the crawling is decreasing, well, what can we do? Just find out. So if there's something on your server that gets crawled less because it is older and older and older, maybe you need to refresh that so that it gets crawled again. And maybe it is a good signal that this kind of content is not really relevant for Google, depending of course on other signals, how good it is ranking and things like that. But just have a look at that and build your segments in a way like that. And of course, we can also have a look, for example, if domains or work with expiry dates. So a lot of, secondhand shops, e-commerce shops do that, for example. They have just, the one product on the one URL, and if it is sold, then it is gone. And how does that actually affect your crawling? And is Google even able to crawl these kind of URLs in the given time? And does it even make sense to index them? Because in some ways it could be the situation that Google is not even able to crawl all these URLs until they got sold. And if that is the case, why putting them maybe in the infrastructure, not just in the internal search? So things like that can be analyzed if you work for or with expiry dates. And the last thing I want to mention is the FreshRank. The FreshRank is a lovely metric, again, when it comes down to understand the entire process from publishing till ranking. So the FreshRank actually tells you the average amount of days between the first Google hit and the first organic hit. So, and with that in mind, it is actually quite lovely because you know when the URL was published, you know when Google hit it first, you know when the first organic hit was, and with that over on scale, you can actually make some interesting, assumptions and forecasts maybe for your content planning, and also, provide that piece of information. How long does it take from, publishing a URL till it got its first traffic? And therefore, it may make sense to have an eye on metrics like that. That being said, this was it for me. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you see the value till today, why we talk about crawling, log file analyzers, what kind of information you can actually get out of it, why it makes sense to build segments on your data so that you really can identify a lot of different things. Look especially for inefficiencies. Please have in mind that all your regular web crawls are just a simulation. There's nothing more accurate than analyzing the log files, because only with that you see what Google is really processing on your server, and therefore give it a try. Have a lovely day and talk soon. Bye.